kind of the last pragmatic thing, but gosh, to me, this is like such an important thing. Get out of our silos. Gillian Tett, who has a PhD in anthropology, she became a writer, reporter for the New York Times. And she wrote a wonderful book called The Silo Effect. Did any of you ever read The Silo Effect? It was a top book on the New York Times bestseller list. What she realizes, the reason most companies and efforts fail is because they get siloed. So what siloed means is they end up in a situation where they will not learn from others, they will not talk to others. They stay in their silo and they only do what's always been done in the silo. And she says companies that do that, so she made an example of this. Apparently at the same time, Apple started coming out with iPods, that had music on it. Sony also was working on digital MP3 players. And they came out at the same time with the Sony Stickman and the Sony something else. I can't remember what the other thing was. The Stickman was like a little pen that you could put 50 songs on and keep it in your pocket. The other was the Sony something, which was a bigger unit. And in both of them, but the silo thing was, in Sony, neither department knew the other was working on it. So actually, Sony came out with two products that competed against each other. And it wasn't well integrated. Can you imagine if they had just brought those two together, how they could have shared information and it would have made a difference? But instead, they came out with two products that both died within 2 years. Meanwhile, Apple, what makes Apple really successful is they're not only creative, but they go out and study what other people do and notice both the successes and failures. So any of you have a flip phone with you, like a smart flip phone? Like Androids make them? You know what I'm talking about? Apple is apparently coming out with one next year, but it's now taking them 10 years to do it because they have been studying the failures of Samsung and Androids and all those kinds of things. When they've done it, they've studied the creases, they've studied all of that. They've realized we've got to come up with something better. And they're also willing to experiment with things and work, and they embrace failure, but they go out and study what other people do. The silo means we're in the silo and we don't study. Presbyterians don't talk to non-Presbyterians. I will say this is my frustration at being what I'm trying to do with this Caring for Clergy and Congregations program. I went into it wanting to work with pastors of all different denominations, and my clients are. I've got Presbyterians, Lutherans, Mennonites, Episcopalian, Anglican, ECO, Presbyterian, Evangelical Presbyterian Church. I have people who range from conservative to progressive to all of these things, because I still believe, even if I don't agree with you on this theological matter, you're still called to ministry. But I find it is really difficult to advertise what we're doing in different denominations because they'll only advertise what's coming out of their own denomination. That's frustrating, because what if you have something that's really helping people grow and stretch, but it doesn't fit your denomination? Then you're not really going and stretching. Then you're going to continue to decline. It's like, a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is still the same stuff, for example, in the Lutheran Church that Andrew Root talks about. But we don't, well, I know, Brian, you had Andrew Root at your church a while ago, but that's not a typical Presbyterian thing to do, is to bring in a Lutheran, right? Well, it was significant when you did that. It's also not traditional to take a Presbyterian and bring them into a Lutheran context. We tend to get in silos, and that's why we rust over. We keep doing the same things. I apologize for this sudden change of venue. My phone went dead during the presentation, so I decided to continue it in my backyard, where they've already baled the hay and they're loading it up onto carts back there. Any rate, I want to continue what we're talking about, moving from the silos and how do you move out of the silos. I learned a big lesson about this back a number of years ago when I heard about how the American car industry came back from a severe decline in the 1980s. In the 1980s, they looked around and realized that the Japanese were killing them with their cars. It used to be in the 70s and 60s that they looked at the Japanese cars as cheap and not particularly good quality. But in the 80s, the Japanese began to make higher quality cars that also were more fuel efficient and that actually needed less service. And so all of a sudden, everybody in America was buying Japanese cars. And Americans were choosing it because they were just better cars than the American ones. And Ford and Chrysler, they didn't know what to do. So one of them, and also GM, one of them actually came up with an idea. What if we just contact the Japanese and ask them if we can take a look at what they're doing? I mean, that's normally what you don't do with your competitors, is asking them to help you. But the Japanese were proud of their products. They were proud of what they were doing. And so they actually said, sure, come on over. We'll show you everything. And so they toured these factories and they realized these factories are state of the art. What we're doing doesn't even compete. And there's one incident that really made a difference. They were looking at how the Japanese were putting the doors onto the car. And they asked their tour guides, so where are your bangers? I think it was called a banger. And they're like, what do you mean? They said, well, we have people with rubber mallets that when you mount the door, they actually use the mallet to bring the door into place and to make sure it fits well. And the Japanese kind of looked quizzical and said, we engineer the doors to fit right when we put them on. This was a revelation to the American car manufacturers, that you could actually improve the way you had always done it. And I learned from that if we're going to grow our church, we need to go and find out what people who are growing churches do and bring some of those ideas back. And so really, beginning in the early 2000s, I began to go to non-denominational evangelical workshops. I began to read their books. And even more than that, I began to visit their churches. And we did the same thing with our church. Once a year in June, we would get a substitute preacher. We would get substitute musicians, and we would take all of our worship people and go and visit different churches. Churches that were all over the Pittsburgh area that were doing well. But here's part of the issue, is that we can be so tribal that we see those successful outside of our tradition almost as enemies. Like they're just inherently bad. And we do that right now with evangelicals, Pentecostals, non-denominationals. We see them as the enemy because we don't agree with where they are politically. And as a result of that, we don't pay attention to what they're doing well. We've become like Sears. Do you remember how big Sears was for more than a century? They were the innovators up until the 80s. And then they stopped innovating. And we've become like them, where we're constantly touting our past and refusing to adapt to the present and the future. You saw it during COVID. We were forced to adapt, but people went kicking and screaming. I will tell you, at Calvin Church, we started live streaming in 2010. So that after I had left the church, but when my successor, David, was there, they not only were already set up for COVID, but they added 4 more cameras so they could do a more professional job of moving cameras around so you could see things from different angles. That's adapting. It's not waiting until a crisis forces you, but it's actually taking a look at what others are doing and doing them. We often become guilty of loving our tradition more than loving people, which is odd because Jesus constantly taught us to love people more than our traditions, and loving people can mean letting go of our traditions, which is what the early church did in bringing together slave and free, male and female, rich and poor, Gentile and Jew. We often are afraid to adapt new ideas and often think that using what others do is stealing. It is not. It is creativity, because that's what creativity did. You all love the Beatles, or I'm assuming you do. The Beatles, you can't describe what their music is because they borrowed from everybody. They borrowed skiffle and rock and rhythm and blues and country and show tunes and Indian music. I mean, they brought it all together but made it uniquely theirs, which is what we did when I was pastor of Calvin Church. And so, as I said, we once a year would take everybody and go visit a church in the Pittsburgh area that was doing something unique. And we visited a lot of churches. We visited Hot Metal Community. We visited Mount Ararat Baptist Church, which is an African American church. We visited Mount Sinai, which was a Jewish synagogue that we visited their 2.5-hour casual Saturday morning Shabbat service. We visited Allegheny Center Alliance Church. We visited Christ Church at Grove Farm. We looked at all of them, and we would go out to lunch afterwards, and we'd talk about what we disliked first to get it out of the way. But I would usually ask the question, where did you experience God? And where did you see others experiencing God? And then we would find ways to integrate those elements into our worship service at least once a year. And to be honest, I have continued this tradition even though I'm no longer serving as a pastor in a church, but instead I'm helping pastors in churches. And periodically, I go with pastors to go visit different churches. We have visited Amplify in Plumboro, which is a huge non-denominational church that is incredible. We visited Impact, which is up by the Pittsburgh airport. We visited Sanctuary, which is a downtown church that is clearly multi-generational, but also multi-ethnic, multi-racial. They are doing what we talk about doing all the time, but never do because we don't know how to do it. I continue to go and study what others do so that even in my helping pastors with their churches, I can point to them to ideas. But the problem is we've got to get out of our silos to be able to go and see what others are doing. What I want you to take away from this is we don't have to be stuck. We don't have to always do what we've always done, but you can't get people to be creative by asking them to stay in their silos and be creative. Being creative means going out and getting other ideas, going out and seeing what other people do. Being like the American car industry and being willing to go to your competitors, if we look at other churches, our competitors, and to learn what they're doing well so that we can adapt to what we're doing well. Okay, it's the end of part 4. I'll see you back in a few moments as we begin to talk about the next part, part 5, which is becoming a guide, not a pilot.